Hello. It is my pleasure to give this presentation for the 2022 International Conference on Financial Technology and Business Analysis. So, I'm going to discuss the emerging role of culture in finance. Um, the finance literature has relatively recently woken up to the importance of culture. Um, Here you can see a number of papers published in some of the leading journals in finance, which underline the role of culture. Um, of course, there have been some studies which go back to earlier years, and they do focus on different aspects of culture in finance. But the overall body of literature on the role of culture in finance is still relatively recent, going back not longer than perhaps 10 years, 5 to 10 years. So this is one of the earlier studies on the role of culture published in JFE, which links culture to differences in religion and language, and then this is linked to openness in a finance context. Um, um, I, of course, all of these studies perhaps beg the question, what is culture? Now, culture is a difficult term to define. It can be defined in a number of ways. For example, Schwartz, who is one of the prominent researchers in this area, talks about the derivatives of experience, which are learned or created by individuals or the population, and they're transmitted from generations to generations. Um, and another common definition of culture is given to us by Hofstede, who views culture as the collective programming of the mind that would distinguish members of one group or category from people from another group or category. So I think anecdotally, we all know what culture refers to, although perhaps at an abstract level it would be somewhat difficult to define. Um, the In terms of papers that have perhaps looked at proxies of culture in finance and in economics, one can also refer to this Journal of Finance paper by Malmendin Tate and Yan, which look at our early life experiences in the context of overconfidence. So, what they show in this paper is that those CEOs who grew up during the years of the Great Depression of 1929 and afterwards in the US, so those CEOs who grew up during those years, who spent their formative years through those years, um, once they became leading managers of firms, then their financial behavior was distinctly different from other CEOs. So they were, for example, averse to debt, and this would lead to suboptimal capital structures. So some sort of debt averseness or debt aversion. And so in relation to this, they would lean more on internal finance versus borrowing. And obviously this has to do with their own or with their parents' negative experiences or painful experiences with debt during the Great Depression, or it could be that there were more painful examples of debt and bankruptcy around them, which would have influenced their attitude and psyche towards debt. So in a sense, the culture through which you're brought up and the experiences that shape that particular culture have a distinct impact on your financial decisions, even years later. Another interesting research in this area is a paper, again published in JFE, on the topic of military CEOs. So CEOs who have spent their time in the military, they have a background in the military, and so those CEOs, they tend to have, again, attributes which are somewhat different from other CEOs, everything else being equal. So for example, they tend to be less likely to be involved in corporate fraud. They tend to pay more tax on average than their peer group, and the discipline and the sense of respect for authority that is part of the fabric of the military culture shows itself in other ways when they make financial decisions about the firms. Another interesting paper in this area, for example, is this Econometrica paper, which looks at matrilineal and patriarchal societies. So female-driven and male-driven societies or cultures. And what they actually show is that what we know about gender differences, so for example, men tend to be more competitive or more risk-taking than women on average, that is based on that is a function of the culture from which those samples of respondents are derived. So men are generally seen to be more overconfident and risk-taking. However, this is fundamentally culture dependent. So in this particular paper, they make a distinction between the Maasai tribe in Africa and the Khasi tribe in India, and one is more matrilineal and one is more patriarchal, and the differences are noticeable in terms of what we typically attribute to gender. As another example, culture also plays a role when it comes to how we process random outcomes, how we perceive luck, and of course sometimes what's known as superstitions. So for example, in the Chinese folk culture, and there are certain numbers which are considered lucky or auspicious, such as 8, for example, the number 8, because in Mandarin it signifies prosperity. I believe it is phonetically similar to the word that connotates prosperity and longevity and wealth. Whereas, for example, the number 4 has the opposite connotation because it sounds like the word death in Mandarin. So Herschleifer has an interesting paper, Herschleifer and his co-authors, where they look at random codes which are assigned to lottery companies, companies that do an IPO, and then they get a lottery of these random codes. And what they notice is that those companies whose IPO code has more of these lucky digits, they tend to initially be oversubscribed and then underperform following that initial overreaction. That underperformance is something like 10% after 3 years. So as you can see, there are different examples of how culture can play a role in financial decisions. As another example, one could look at the role of culture when it comes to loss aversion. So loss aversion is obviously very prevalent in behavioral finance. It's well studied. It's the idea that we generally hate losing money far more than we enjoy gaining money of the same magnitude. So typically, losses tend to be 2 to 3 times more painful than gains are enjoyable. So losing, let's say, $1,000 would make you two to three times on average more unhappy than winning $1,000 would make you happy. And so this loss aversion would lead to certain behaviors. We tend to, for example, in disposition effect, we tend to hold on to losing positions because realizing the losses would create this would lead to this loss aversion bias. So that's why investors tend to keep their losing positions, and they would rather break even or get even before they get out. Now, something like this, which is very fundamental in behavioral finance, also depends on culture. For example, in a study by Credit Suisse, individual respondents were ranked based on their level of loss aversion, their loss aversion coefficient, which is, as I said, typically something like between 2 to 3 for typical gains and losses. But for example, in a country like Russia, that coefficient is relatively high, close to 6. So Russians, according to this study, tend to be quite loss averse. On the other extreme, we have a country like Australia, which is still loss averse because the coefficient is more than 1, but it's less than 2, so it's probably close to 1.5, and that shows the range of loss aversion coefficients that you can get by looking at how people from different countries and from different cultures may make the same financial decisions or the same financial choices in different ways. And of course, in order to dig deeper, one can look at their shared experiences, their for example, in countries like Russia, Georgia, Estonia, and generally Eastern European countries, perhaps loss aversion is a function of their shared experiences through the years of communism, which would have meant that private ownership was deprived and was declared not as a given right, and hence that has led possibly to a feeling of loss aversion fundamentally, which has survived up until now. So as mentioned, Eastern Europeans tend to be far more loss averse on average than, for example, the rest of the world, and than, for example, the Anglo-Saxon countries. Now, when it comes to categorizing culture, measuring culture, you could look at a number of metrics, a number of dimensions to categorize countries or national cultures. Gerd Hofstede, who has done quite a lot of research in this area, for example, has a scale known as the Hofstede scale, which categorizes national cultures based on 6 dimensions of power distance, individualism versus collectivism, femininity versus masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term versus short-term orientation, and whether the culture is a culture of indulgence or a culture of restraint. Now, very quickly, I have been involved in a number of papers which have used some of these concepts. In this paper, for example, we looked at the cultural heritage of CEOs, where they come from, and how where they come from has a role to play in the way they deal with competition. So we've looked at American CEOs in the banking sector, where their ancestors come from, where they come from, where their ancestors come from, and whether they are second generation, third generation, fourth generation immigrants, for example. And what we show in this particular paper, and of course I'm doing a very, very quick summary, is that descendants of immigrants tend to behave differently. And also it depends where you come from, whether the culture of the country from which you immigrate is quite different from the culture to which you from the culture of the country to which you immigrate. And we show that this cultural heritage matters for the performance of the firm and for the choices and the decisions that the CEO makes. In showing this, we look at, for example, generation 2 to 3 CEOs, and we specifically show that they tend to be more resilient in the face of competition in the overall environment. The firms that they manage tend to have a higher performance in terms of return on assets compared to CEOs who have not immigrated recently. So perhaps they're 4th or 5th generation immigrants, so closer to natives, so to speak. And of course it depends where they come from, and how similar or different the culture of the country of origin is from the country of destination. In this paper, Transparency in Investment Decisions, we look at the role of transparency in financial decisions of investors, specifically their impact on the disposition effects. And amongst other things, we look at the culture of transparency. So how investors from the former East Germany tend to be different from investors from the former West Germany. So although the data we look at is quite recent, what we notice is that if you look at people who live in what was West Germany right now, versus those who live in what was East Germany right now, they tend to be quite different. And we think the culture of surveillance, which persisted in the former East Germany, led to shared experiences of omnipresent surveillance. And so when it comes to the transparency in portfolios of the stocks that they manage, there's a differential impact, and that is shown through returns and through the disposition effect. And finally, in this paper, my colleague and I, we look at the Japanese national culture and its impact on herding when it comes to corporate governance codes. So we look at the Japanese culture. The Japanese culture is very well documented in being quite different and unique in various ways. When you look at the Japanese culture in Hofstede, it ranks relatively extreme in certain aspects, such as masculinity or respect for authority, or long-term orientation and conformity. So all of these do, again, play a role when managers make financial decisions for their firms. For example, the respect for authority, the conformity, the strong sense of community can, under some certain conditions, lead to some form of herding. And what we show in this paper is that when the Japanese government introduced voluntary codes of corporate governance, which were supposed to be voluntary, so firms should have chosen to comply or not comply, almost all Japanese companies chose to comply with those codes out of a sense of respect for the government and herding. And this was to the detriment of their financial performance, to the detriment of the choices they make for their company from a purely rational perspective. So I hope this has been a quick tour of the role of culture in finance, and then a bit of a spotlight on a number of projects that I have had the pleasure of being involved in. Thank you very much for your attention, and all the best.